No one in the village slept that night, not because of the wind or wolves howling along the edge of the forest. Those sounds were familiar. What kept them awake was the silence, a silence so heavy it made people aware of their own heartbeat. The oil lamp flickered in front of the small church where the men gathered without being summoned. They did not come to pray. They came because if nothing was done before dawn, another bed in the village would be empty. It might belong to a child. It might belong to an old person, already too weak to cry for help in the dark. Shovels leaned against the stone wall, their metal blades worn and darkened by soil. No one looked at them for long. Everyone knew they were not meant for farming tonight. A woman stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands clenched around her shawl. Her son had burned with fever for 3 nights in a row. Each morning he woke weaker than the day before, as if something had taken a portion of what little life remained in him before sunrise. She did not cry. Her tears had dried by the second night. They did not need much debate. The arguments had already happened over the past week, in whispers, in averted glances, in sentences left unfinished. Everyone knew what was about to happen was wrong. They also knew that doing nothing would allow that wrongness to keep taking the living. "We have no time," a voice said, hoarse and low. No one asked who spoke. At this moment, names no longer mattered. The church door opened. No priest walked with them. No blessing was given. Tonight, there was no representative of God. Only those still strong enough to stand and the people they were trying to keep alive. The path to the graveyard was narrow and slick. Damp earth yielded underfoot, as if the ground itself was unsure what it should keep and what it should release. Old graves slid past in torchlight, tilted headstones, inscriptions worn thin by years. No one stopped. They had passed this place their entire lives, never for this reason. The grave they sought lay at the far edge where the land dipped low and grass grew thin, a death not long past, too close, too recent enough that memory was still warm and fear had not yet cooled. No one spoke the name of the person buried there, saying it would make everything too real. The first strike of the shovel hit the earth with a dull, hollow sound, louder than expected. A few men flinched, not from cold. The night was not that cold, but because they had crossed a boundary, none of them ever believed they would approach. The soil was turned in heavy, deliberate strokes. No one spoke. Each movement carried a question no one dared to ask aloud. Are we doing what is right, or only trying to survive one more day? From somewhere in the distance came a cough. Harsh, broken. A man turned his head and closed his eyes for a moment. He knew that cough. It came from the house where his wife lay too weak to stand, too exhausted to be afraid anymore. None of them believed they were evil. They were not digging out of hatred. They were digging because they had tried everything else. Garlic hung over doors. Crosses marked window frames. Prayers whispered until throats burned dry. Nothing stopped the illness from spreading from house to house, from bed to bed, faster than rumor. A younger man paused, breathing hard. "What if we are wrong?" he asked, his voice breaking into the night. No one answered at first. The question had already echoed inside their heads for days. Finally, an older man spoke slowly, as if speaking to himself, rather than to the others. "If we do nothing, someone will be dead by morning," he said. "That much is certain." There was no protest, only quiet nods. At last, the shovel struck something harder than soil. The sound changed, deep and solid. They had reached it. A few stepped back instinctively, as if standing too close might alert whatever lay beneath that they had come. The torch was brought nearer. Breath left their mouths, in thin streams, not from cold, but because everyone was trying to breathe as lightly as possible, as if afraid of waking something that was never meant to wake. In that moment, none of them thought about legends or stories told around the hearth. They thought only of the people gasping for air in the village, of beds that might be empty by morning, the truth that sometimes, to save the living people, are forced to do what they have been taught. Their entire lives must never be done. The ground had opened. and with it a choice with no way back. That night, the village not only dug up a grave, they unearthed their deepest fear and chose to face it because there was no other way. The morning after that night arrived more slowly than usual, not because the sun rose late, but because no one in the village had truly slept enough to wake. When pale gray light spilled over the low roofs, it did not feel like a beginning. It felt like a reluctant continuation of a night that had not yet ended. The first family affected lived at the end of the dirt road, where death had arrived earlier than it had elsewhere. Before that morning, they were simply one household among many in mourning. After it, they became something the village began to watch. The wife did not leave the house. The eldest daughter carried water back from the well, but dropped the bucket at the doorstep, her hands shaking too hard to keep hold of the wooden handle. The youngest son lay in bed all day, eyes open but unfocused, as if staring through the ceiling, following something only he could see. They grew thin at a frightening speed. Not the thinness of hunger, but a kind of wasting with no explanation. Food still arrived, and bowls of soup were still warm, yet nothing seemed to remain in their bodies long enough to become strength. Each morning they woke more exhausted than the day before, as if nightfall was not meant for rest, but for something to be taken. No one in the village named what was happening. To name it would be to admit it was real. Stories began to surface, not in gatherings, but in the quiet spaces between two people by the well along the narrow path to the fields, in the brief moment when someone turned away too quickly after meeting another's eyes. The wife felt a weight pressing on her chest each night, not pain, but pressure, as if the air in the room had suddenly thickened. She woke drenched in cold sweat, heart racing, mouth open, but unable to make a sound. When movement returned, the sensation was gone, leaving behind a fatigue that clung to her until well past noon. The eldest daughter dreamed of her father standing at the foot of her bed. He did nothing and said nothing. He simply stood there in the dark, as if waiting. When she jolted awake, the room was empty, yet the air felt colder than usual, and on her arm appeared a faint round bruise, painless with no memory of how it had come to be. The bruises began to appear more often on wrists, on shoulders, on legs, small, pale, unmistakably new. No one asked directly, because asking would force someone to speak aloud what they themselves had not yet dared to accept. A neighbor, when asked why he looked so worn, only shook his head and said he had not slept well. No one pressed further. No one slept well these days, yet there was a subtle difference between insomnia and waking, as if one had run a long distance in the night with no memory of where one had gone. Children began to cry more when darkness fell. They did not say they were afraid. They simply clung to the adults, refused to leave. The light refused to lie alone. When asked, they said only that there was something in the room, though they could not say what. The adults understood more than the children, and for that very reason, they were more afraid. There was no clear shape to point to, no footsteps, no shadow crossing a doorway. Only a feeling, a persistent sense that night was no longer a safe time, that when the light went out, something was permitted to exist, to move and to touch the living in ways that left no clear mark. Prayers began to change. Before, people prayed for the dead to rest. Now they prayed for the living to be left alone. Some slept with lamps burning all night. Others pushed their beds tight against the wall, as if shrinking the space where something might appear. Some stayed awake until morning and collapsed only after the sun rose, catching a few shallow hours of sleep that did nothing to erase the feeling of being watched. In brief conversations, there was always a pause that lasted too long, the moment when someone was about to say what everyone was thinking and no one wanted to be the first to give it words. Had they not gone? Had that death failed to end the way it was supposed to? Those questions hung in the air without needing to be spoken. They lived in the way people avoided looking toward the house at the end of the road, in the way voices dropped when passing the graveyard, in the fact that no one spoke the dead person's name at night anymore, not out of respect, but out of fear of being heard. One afternoon, the youngest son of that family could no longer rise. His breathing was shallow, eyes tightly shut, lips pale as if the blood in his body had forgotten the way back. When the news spread, no one said they had expected it, yet in their eyes was something like quiet confirmation of a fear that had been there all along. The most frightening part was not the feeling of being attacked, but the feeling of not knowing who was doing the attacking. There was no shape to fight, no face to accuse, no way to be certain that what was happening was not simply imagination pushed too far by grief and sleeplessness. And it was in that uncertainty that fear grew fastest. Because when something returns without needing a clear form, people do not know where to shut the door or which way to turn their faces to avoid it. Night fell again, and with it came a question the village could no longer ignore. If it did not need a body to return, how could it ever be stopped? It happened on a heavy gray afternoon, when the village had not yet caught its breath after nights without sleep. There was no church bell, no summons. Only a small group of people lingered longer than usual on the open ground near the well, and this time the silence was no longer avoidance. It was preparation. The first person to speak was not the most aggressive nor the most powerful. He was simply a man who had lost 2 cows in a single week and had a wife confined to her bed, unable to stand. When he said the name, his voice was not loud, but it carried clearly enough for everyone to hear. In that moment, everything shifted. The name did not belong to a stranger. It belonged to the dead, a death still so recent that the hearth in that house had not yet gone cold. A death that only days earlier had drawn neighbors carrying bread in quiet sympathy. Now the name fell into the center of the village like a heavy object no one had time to step away from. No one objected at first. Shock held them still. A few people turned their eyes away by instinct, as if looking directly at the thing would make it too real. But the silence did not last. The family of the dead stepped forward from the crowd, and their voices rose, trembling but firm. They said he was their father, their husband, a man who had lived his entire life without harming anyone. They said his death had already been painful enough, and that no one had the right to drag it back into the world this way. None of that was untrue, yet something had changed in the eyes of those listening. Fear was no longer vague. It had found something to hold on to. The argument did not erupt loudly at first. It began with questions. Why had this family weakened the fastest after the death? Why had the bruises appeared here first? Why was this child the one who had fallen most gravely ill? The questions were asked in calm voices, but each one landed like a needle. The family pushed back harder. They reminded everyone that illness had appeared in many houses. They said every death carried grief and exhaustion with it. They said people were looking for someone to blame because they could not bear the absence of an explanation. As they spoke, a few heads lowered, not in agreement, but because the truth of it was frighteningly clear. The village split in two, without anyone needing to draw a line. On one side were those who still believed the dead should be left alone. On the other were those too exhausted to keep waiting. Between them stood not reason, but time. Each passing day left another person weaker, and with every loss, the arguments grew shorter and sharper. For the first time, death was no longer a private matter for one household. It became a shared threat. And once that happened, old boundaries began to loosen. People no longer whispered. They spoke more openly, though their voices stayed low. They met one another's eyes and did not look away when passing the family of the dead. The children noticed the change before the adults did. They stopped playing near that house. They fell silent when the familiar name was mentioned. An invisible distance formed quickly and coldly. No rules were given, no orders were spoken. Fear organizes itself very well. The elders tried to intervene. They said there had been seasons like this before, and that everything eventually passed. But even they did not sound certain. This time felt different. Not only illness, but a sense of being watched. A sense that the death had not settled where it was supposed to. One evening, the family of the dead closed their doors earlier than usual. The light inside their house went dark, before night had fully arrived. It was not an act of defense, but of withdrawal. Yet withdrawal itself looked like admission to those searching for signs. The accusations grew clearer, not in official gatherings, but in ordinary life. A look that lingered too long, a sentence cut short when someone approached, a space opening around that family in the shared life of the village. They understood they were losing their place, not because they had done anything wrong, but because fear needed a sacrifice to cling to. They tried to stay, tried to live as before, but each step felt heavier than the last. Every door closing behind them echoed louder in their minds. Once the name had been spoken aloud, it could not be taken back. Even without an official declaration, even without a single concrete action, something irreversible had already happened. From that moment on, the death was no longer a painful memory. It became a living suspicion, an open question. The village faced every time night fell. And when someone has been named, everything around them begins to change in ways no one can control. Nothing remains as it was. It cannot remain as it was anymore. The fear that gripped the village was not born in the recent nights. It had been there long before stone houses were built, before there was a church, before dirt roads were packed down by the steps of the living. It was a fear passed on, not through instruction, but through habit, in the way people slowed their pace near the edge of the forest and lowered their voices when speaking of the dead after nightfall. In this land, death was never understood as a complete departure. It was closer to a change of position than an ending. The dead did not disappear. They simply moved elsewhere, and because they moved, it was believed they could return to the places most familiar to them, if given reason strong enough. The old world view here never drew a sharp line between the living and the dead. It treated the earth as something that remembered for a long time, something that did not easily forget what had once rested upon it. Every house was raised from soil that had held countless footsteps, countless sleeps, countless breaths. When someone died, their trace did not leave with the coffin. It seeped into the floor, into the threshold, into the walls they had once leaned against. People believed that the soul was bound to what had been most familiar in life, not to a distant heaven or a place no one had ever seen, but to the kitchen table where they had sat each evening, the window from which they had watched the fields, the narrow road they had walked thousands of times. Memory did not dissolve into the air. It lingered, and so did the soul. Because of this, dying did not mean leaving. It meant only that a person was no longer in their old place. But if something unsettled them, if there was an emotion strong enough to hold them back, that movement might never be fully completed. The elders used to say that a soul was like smoke. It searched for a way upward, but if the ceiling was too low, if the windows were shut too tight, it would circle endlessly inside the old room. Not out of malice, but because it did not know where else to go. That was why windows were opened when someone died. Why were the covers and furniture rearranged? Not only for mourning, but to remind the soul that the world had shifted and that it must shift as well. But rituals were not always enough. Some deaths came too suddenly. Some people left carrying words never spoken, confessions never made, resentments never heard. Those emotions were heavier than any prayer. They bound the soul in place like a cord no one could see. Here people believed memory had weight. The more someone had loved, the more they had hated, the heavier that weight became. Souls burdened with such weight did not leave the earth easily. They lingered around the things that had once made them feel alive. Because of this, a house was not only a shelter for the living, it was also a storehouse for what had happened before. Every wall had witnessed anger, laughter, and promises. When the person bound to those memories died, the memories did not fade on their own. They waited. The village's curiosity about what was happening was not the curiosity of those unfamiliar with old stories. It was the slow realization that what they had long considered legend might be stepping beyond the safe boundaries of storytelling. When people began asking why that family had weakened so quickly, they were also asking whether a soul that had not left might still be lingering in the places it knew best. The recent sleepless nights brought old warnings back to the surface. Do not speak the dead person's name after dark. Do not cross their threshold too quickly. Do not place objects back where they used to be in the first days after burial. What once sounded like superstition took on new meaning when fear moved closer. If souls were bound to the earth, then the land around the village had retained many of them. If souls were bound to houses, then every home held more than one presence. And if souls were bound to memory, then the most painful memories might become the strongest reason to stay. People began to look at familiar places differently. The road walked every day seemed longer. The house that once felt safe revealed corners never noticed before, not because something new had appeared, but because the way of seeing had changed. In this land, fear of the dead did not come from believing them to be evil. It came from their closeness, too familiar, too entwined with what the living still depended on to survive. When that boundary blurred, fear no longer needed a shape to spread. And then a question began to surface in many minds at once. No one spoke it aloud, yet everyone felt it there like a constant whisper. If death was not a departure, if the soul was bound to earth, to home to memory, then when they did not leave, where were they? Some fears do not wait for people to grow up. They are already waiting from the moment a child draws their first breath. In this land, people do not believe that every child begins life on equal ground. Some children are welcomed, others are watched. The difference is never spoken aloud. It appears in the midwife's first look when the child is born, in the brief hesitation before the adults choose a name, in the way neighbors slow their steps when passing the gate. No one accuses a child, but no one fully trusts them either. There are signs passed from mouth to mouth across generations. Born on a day considered heavy with bad weight, entering the world with a thin membrane still clinging to the skin, crying too little or too much. Things that elsewhere would be dismissed as chance are here arranged into an old order where everything carries meaning and nothing happens without consequence. Children marked in this way grow up beneath a gaze that never leaves them. The gaze is not violent, not hateful. It is a steady surveillance, as if the village is waiting to see whether time will confirm what it faintly suspected from the beginning. Every illness, every fall, every unusual behavior is remembered more carefully than it would be for others. They learn silence earlier than other children, not because they are taught, but because they discover that speaking less is safer. Laughing less draws less attention. They avoid standing at the center of games, avoid firelight when night falls, and avoid questions they do not know how to answer correctly. The adults do not chase them away, but they rarely pull them close. A careful distance is maintained, not far enough to be called cruelty, not close enough to require responsibility, if fear one day proves justified. These children still go to school, still work, still grow alongside the village. Yet they always feel an invisible cord, pulling them slightly outside the shared circle. When something bad happens, the first glances slide toward them, even if they do not linger. When things go well, no one mentions their presence as part of what is good. This sense of not belonging needs no spoken confirmation. It is cultivated through small gestures, through no one choosing them first for an important task, through their names being called a beat later in gatherings, through the silence that stretches one breath longer when they enter a room. Here people believe fate can cling to a person before they have formed their first memory. And when that belief endures long enough, it becomes a sentence without a judge. The child does not know what they have done wrong, yet they grow up with the feeling that they must prove something no one has clearly named. The injustice lies in the fact that these children are not allowed the same mistakes as others. An impulsive act is remembered longer. A small outburst of anger is given added meaning. The same behavior from someone else would be dismissed as passing. When the village begins whispering about what happens at night, those old looks return faster. No one says the children are involved, but they are regarded as unanswered questions. And suspicion does not need evidence to survive. It only needs time. Mothers sense this more sharply than anyone. They look at their children and understand that some battles do not begin with actions, but with how others look at you. They try to protect their children through silence, by keeping them indoors after dark, by avoiding paths where eyes might linger too long. But that protection also admits something else, that the danger is real. These children grow up carrying a chill they cannot name, not because they believe themselves to be monsters, but because they sense that if the village ever needs an explanation for something unbearable, they will be the easiest answer. They live, but they are not considered to fully belong. They exist in the village as a possibility, always held in suspension, a possibility that has not happened, but is never ruled out, and that alone makes their lives heavier from the very beginning. When stories of the dead who have not left begin to spread, those gazes sharpen. No one accuses a child. Yet everyone knows that in the history of this land, judgments have rarely waited until a person was old enough to understand what they were being judged for. Some sentences are delivered very early, long before one understands what it means to live. There is a quieter kind of fear than the sound of the night wind. It is the fear that teaches people to point at someone who is still alive and call them by a name meant for what has not yet died. In this land, fear does not only face the dead. It creeps toward those who still breathe, still walk, but have never been considered fully belonging. The idea of the living Strigoi does not appear as an open accusation. It exists in the way voices change when a certain person is mentioned, in how people avoid standing too close to some individuals after dark, and in the fact that certain names are always whispered instead of spoken aloud. The living Strigoi are not monsters wearing human skin. They are human, but believed to carry something wrong inside them. People say the living Strigoi can drain life without touching, that crops grow more slowly where they pass, that milk thins when they look at the cattle, that air grows heavier when they enter a room. These claims require no proof. They only require coincidence. And coincidence is always plentiful when harvests fail and illness spreads. Drought arrives without warning. Rain skips the fields that need it most. Grain heads form and dry before they can ripen. Livestock grow sick for no clear reason. In ordinary years, this is called misfortune. In years when death refuses to stay still, it is called a sign. When causes cannot be found, people begin searching for targets. They look around the village and notice those who have long stood slightly outside the shared circle, the ones not invited to sit close to the hearth, the ones rarely trusted with important tasks, the ones whose names come to mind first when something goes wrong. The living Strigoi rarely defend themselves. To defend oneself is to admit that there is something that needs defending. They learn to endure, to lower their heads, to walk faster when passing through crowded places. But the quieter they become, the more convenient they grow for other people's fear. A failed season makes the whispers louder. A lingering illness thickens suspicion. Words begin linking separate events into a chain that feels logical. Rain does not come because someone has tied it down. Cattle waste away because someone has taken their vitality. Children fall ill because an unclean gaze lingered too long. No one says they are certain, but many say they feel it. And in that moment, feeling is considered enough, because feeling offers something reason cannot. It offers relief. When one person is suspected of being a living Strigoi, the entire village breathes a little easier, not because fear disappears, but because it has found a place to rest. Fear needs a face to cling to. Once it has one, confusion gains order, loss gains cause, and anger finds somewhere to be placed. The suspected person does not need to have done anything wrong. They only need to be different. Different in how they speak, different in how they look, different in lacking anyone powerful enough to stand fully in their defense. Those born under watchful eyes realize that the gaze never vanished. It was only waiting for the right moment to change its name. Resentment grows quietly. not the resentment of the accused, but of those around them, because blaming one person is far easier than accepting that the world can be cruel without reason. When drought drags on and illness spares no house, believing that someone stands behind it, all preserves a fragile sense of control. Gatherings grow shorter. Laughter appears less often. In its place come heavy nods when a certain name is mentioned. No formal decision is needed. No council convenes. Agreement forms naturally through glances and silence. The suspected person senses the change before understanding its source. Doors close earlier. Greetings are skipped. Familiar work is no longer offered. They still live in the village, yet each day feels like standing at its edge. The most frightening thing about the living Strigoi is not whether they truly exist, but that belief in them does. That belief is strong enough to turn a human being into a vessel for collective fear, strong enough to turn difference into evidence. And when death refuses to stay still, fear must move faster. It slides from the dead to the living with ease. If the living can also be the source, the village does not need to wait for another coffin to act. In this land, people learn to survive by shrinking the circle of safety. Each time it tightens, someone is pushed outside. Not because they are more dangerous, but because they are more convenient for fear-seeking escape. When one person is suspected, the village breathes easier, not because it has found the truth, but because it has found a face. And fear has always tended to search for a face to cling to. That death was unlike the ones before it. It did not arrive with a long illness or a body slowly failing day by day. It came suddenly rough and abrupt, leaving a gap no one had prepared for. By the time it was discovered, it was too late to call it an accident and too clear to accept it as something ordinary. Hint person died alone. No one was there. No final words. No careful arrangements were made by someone who knew their end was coming. Only the traces of a decision made in silence, ending in an act the village refused to speak of by its full name. Suicide is a heavy word. In this place, it carries even more weight than death itself. It is believed to bring with it unresolved resentment and a refusal to leave in a proper way. People here believe such deaths do not close the door between the worlds, but leave it partly open. And anything left unfinished has a way of stretching its influence far beyond a single life. The one who died had always been quiet, never disruptive, never prominent, yet carrying more than anyone had ever asked about. Years of living slightly outside, the shared circle had accumulated until endurance turned into something dense and trapped. When the death happened, many suddenly realized they had never truly seen this person at all. The funeral was quick and subdued. No one lingered long, not for lack of grief, but because an unease spread through the air. People avoided looking directly at the coffin, avoided standing too close, avoided questions whose answers frightened them. After that, death illness spread faster, no longer scattered fevers or slow decline. Children fell sick overnight. Adults collapsed while still standing. Those thought to be past the worst suddenly worsened without warning. The speed left no time to name the fear before it had already entered another house. The familiar signs appeared more densely. Heavy breathing, pain in the chest. Bodies are cold despite unchanged weather. Pale bruises blooming on the skin of the sick, though no one had touched them. This time it was no longer one family or a handful of homes. The entire village began to sink into the same rhythm of exhaustion. Coincidence was no longer enough to explain it. A bad death had occurred, and afterward, everything clearly worsened. No one dared to declare the connection aloud, but the silent confirmation was visible in their eyes. What had once been dismissed as superstition now took on the shape of a rule. Old warnings were remembered about deaths left unfinished, about souls burdened with resentment, about the danger of burying heavy emotions alongside the body without release. Stories once told, as cautionary tales, now returned with unsettling precision. No one said they should wait longer. No one believed patience alone would allow things to settle. Each passing day meant another body weakening another house, closing its doors early, another lamp burning through the night. Waiting now meant accepting further loss. Conversations grew shorter and more forceful. No more circling the issue. No more attempts to soften the edges. Those who had once objected fell silent, not because their beliefs had changed, but because reality had exceeded their ability to defend them. That death became the turning point. Before it, everything could still be argued. After it, everything demanded reaction. People no longer asked whether there was a connection. They began asking what had to be done next. The illness no longer discriminated. It moved through households untouched by suspicion as easily as through those under scrutiny. Fear did not shrink, it expanded. If anyone could be affected, what was happening was no longer the problem of one individual. In that moment, the village understood it had gone too far to return to what it had been, yet not far enough to control what was unfolding. Old remedies no longer worked. Old beliefs began to crack. Moral boundaries, once held firmly in place, started to shift. That bad death took more than one life. It took away the sense that events were still manageable. From that point on, decisions would no longer be choices between right and wrong, but between survival and losing yet another person. And from that moment, everything moved beyond control. After that, Death Night was no longer a time for recovery. It became another territory, one where familiar rules were reversed. During the day, people could still persuade themselves that things remained under control. But when the sun went down, reason weakened along with the light. The first nights passed in silent tension. No one slept deeply. No one dared to turn the lamps completely off. People lay listening to every small sound of the house, as if it were trying to say something that could not be heard during the day. Wood creaked softly. Wind slipped through narrow gaps. Sounds once harmless now felt sharp. Then the dreams began to change. They were no longer the scattered images that come with exhaustion. They became clear and structured. Many people dreamed of the same thing without ever speaking to one another. The dead stood at the foot of the bed. They did not step closer. They did not speak. They simply stood there long enough for the person lying down to realize they were not alone. The dreams ended the same way. The dreamer woke, unable to move. Eyes open, body pinned to the bed. The chest grew heavy. Breathing shortened and thinned, as if the air in the room were being drawn away bit by bit. They wanted to call out to someone, but their mouth would not open. They wanted to rise, but the body refused. The sensation of breath being taken did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, long enough for awareness and panic to grow, long enough to wonder whether this was only a nightmare or something truly happening. When the body finally moved again, the room was empty, but the exhaustion remained. Those who experienced it did not speak at once. They waited for morning, waited for a more reasonable explanation. But when the stories began to match, silence grew heavy. No one wanted to be the first to admit that sleep itself had betrayed them. Children were affected most clearly. They woke screaming in the night without an obvious cause. They said someone was standing in the room. When adults turned on the light, there was nothing there but familiar walls. Yet the children continued to shake, not because of imagination, but because they had not yet learned to hide fear the way adults had. Adults began to fear sleep more than wakefulness. They stretched the daytime with pointless tasks just to delay the moment of lying down. Some sat by the hearth until morning. Some leaned against walls with eyes open through the night. Some drank not to forget, but to tire the body enough to stop dreaming. But sleep could not be avoided forever. When it came, it did not bring rest. It brought confrontation. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were often the ones who woke in the worst condition, gasping for air, faces drained of color, new bruises appearing on wrists or shoulders, faint but unmistakable. The bruises did not hurt. That was what made them more frightening. They felt like signs of contact without memory. No one remembered being touched, but the body remembered. No one dared to sleep deeply anymore. Deep sleep meant letting down one's guard, and at this time, vigilance was the only thing people felt they still possessed. Shallow sleep replaced peaceful nights. People woke repeatedly, just to make sure they were still breathing, still able to move. The village slipped into a distorted rhythm. By day, people moved slowly like shadows of themselves. By night, lamps no longer went out all at once. Each household decided its own degree of fear. Some stayed lit until morning. Some kept only a small flame in the corner. Some left doors slightly open, as if afraid that enclosed space might trap something inside. Prayers no longer brought comfort. People prayed with caution rather than trust. They were not sure who was listening. They only knew that speaking felt better than complete silence. Lack of sleep began to blur the line between dreaming and waking. Some saw movement at the edge of their vision and found nothing when they turned. Some heard their names called in the night and discovered empty rooms. No one could be sure what was real. And where certainty vanished, fear found room to grow. The most terrifying thing was not that the dreams were shared. It was the feeling that they did not entirely leave when waking came. They lingered in the chest and the lungs, in the way breathing no longer settled into its old rhythm. People began to understand that night was no longer a safe boundary. When the light disappeared, they not only lost sight, they lost the right to relax. Sleep had once been the most instinctive human act. Now it had become a threat that required defense. And when sleep itself became dangerous, the village realized there was nowhere left to hide from what was happening. When sleep was no longer a refuge, people turned back to the things that had once made them feel safe. Not because they believed completely, but because there were no other options left. In this land, protective measures had existed longer than the memory of anyone still alive. They were passed down more as familiar motions than as beliefs needing explanation. Garlic came first, hung on windows, tied into strings across doorways, placed beneath children's pillows. The sharp smell spread through the village so quickly that soon no one noticed it anymore. Crosses were taken out of old chests, wiped clean, and hung on walls. Some drew holy signs on door frames with white chalk. Others sprinkled blessed water around their beds before lying down. The rituals were performed carefully. No one rushed through them. They remembered the correct order, the proper time, the details they had been warned never to skip. People believed that a single mistake would undo the effect. So they moved slowly, precisely as if accuracy itself could keep fear standing still. In the first days, these measures brought brief relief. Simply having something to do made people feel less helpless. Lamps burning by doorways, combined with the smell of garlic and sacred symbols, created the illusion that boundaries had been set. Some slept a little longer. Some children cried less when night fell. But the feeling did not last. Death did not care whether things were done correctly or not. It arrived according to its own rhythm. Someone who had followed every ritual still fell ill in the night. A child who slept beneath a burning lamp still woke with heavy breath. The familiar signs continued as if nothing had changed. Despair did not arrive all at once. It crept in through small details. When people realized the smell of garlic no longer brought reassurance. When the cross on the wall became a powerless ornament. When prayers were recited from memory, but no longer felt heard. Some began to doubt themselves. They wondered whether they had done it correctly, whether a step had been missed, whether something had been placed in the wrong spot. These questions drove them to repeat the rituals more often. More garlic, more symbols. Everything layered thicker, as if quantity could compensate for failing effect. But death did not pause to observe human effort. It continued to appear in the most carefully protected houses. This cracked belief in the most dangerous way possible. When defenses fail, people do not only lose safety, they lose the ground that allows them to reassure themselves. Short, heavy phrases began circulating through the village. Perhaps these things are not enough. Perhaps we are facing something stronger. No one wanted to be the first to voice that conclusion. Yet when it surfaced, many eyes darkened, as if they had been thinking it for some time. Those who had once defended the old rituals now fell silent, not because they no longer believed, but because they no longer knew what to believe in. What had once served as a barrier now stood only as evidence of collective desperation. Some households began to abandon the rituals out of exhaustion, not in rebellion, but in fatigue. Garlic was hung once and left to wither. Nothing was replaced. Nothing was repeated. They lay down, thinking that if nothing worked, at least they would not spend another night struggling to do it right. Other homes moved in the opposite direction. They intensified everything until the space itself felt suffocating. Windows covered, lights never turned off, human breath and garlic mixed until the air grew heavy. Yet even in those houses, breathing still shortened when night came. Death continued to strike without pattern. It showed no respect for those who were more careful. It avoided no one who believed more deeply. That made the injustice impossible to ignore. If doing everything right offered no protection, what meaning did right and wrong still hold? In that moment, the village began to understand that they had exhausted everything familiar. The defenses that had once carried them through smaller fears were no longer enough for what now stood before them. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because what they faced had surpassed the limits of those measures. Desperation reached a point where it could no longer be hidden behind ritual. It showed in the way people looked at one another in the morning, in the way they spoke less and decided faster, in the fact that no one suggested hanging another symbol on the wall. When defense was no longer enough, people began thinking about action. And that thought itself marked a dangerous shift, because when protective belief collapses, what follows is no longer pleading, but choice. The first morning when children began to die arrived quickly and without permission. There was no long fever to prepare for it. No warning signs are clear enough for adults to pray one more time. The child slipped away during the night and was discovered before dawn, breath so faint that no one noticed the exact moment it ended. The news spread faster than any church bell. People moved from house to house carrying the same unspoken question: why children? Until then, illness had worn adults down, but left time behind. This time it did not. This time, it took the most fragile lives first. It was not just one. By midday, another child collapsed. Then another before the afternoon ended. Small bodies could not withstand what was moving through the village. They breathed fast eyes, open yet unresponsive. Adult hands pressed to their chests, searching for the familiar rhythm, and found only silence. Panic needed no spark. It ignited on its own when parents realized that every measure they had followed for night after night had not kept their children alive. Lamps burning until morning saved no one. Strings of garlic across doors stopped nothing. That same day, the livestock began to fall, not one by one over time, but in sequence, as if strength were being drained from their bodies within hours. Cows that had pulled plows all day could no longer stand. They gasped, eyes clouded, and collapsed onto damp ground, never to rise again. People watched and understood that whatever was happening did not discriminate. It moved through humans and animals alike. It touched the living and took what was most essential. When the livestock fell, fear moved beyond grief. It reached long survival. Without animals, the next season would starve. Without children, the future ended here. Old arguments became meaningless. No one asked about right or wrong anymore. No one invoked ritual or tradition to delay. When children die, first, every principle moves too slowly. Words once weighed carefully were discarded. People spoke shorter, decided faster, and looked at one another with the same cold understanding. There was no time left to wait for proof. No time to hope that things would stop on their own. Each passing hour could mean another name, spoken quietly. Urgency warped the way people thought. Those who had once resisted no longer had the strength to do so. They were busy holding on to what remained. The village moved like a wounded body. Some ran for healers. Some prepared burials. Others gathered what could still be used. No one had a complete plan. They only knew that standing still meant losing more lives. Eyes that once held suspicion now looked empty. Panic erased old divisions. There were no clear sides anymore. Only people trying to keep their breathing unbroken. In that state, questions of morality sounded distant. Survival became the only standard that still applied. Children were kept indoors all day. Adults did not let them out of sight even for a moment. Yet even that vigilance brought no comfort. Death had already proven it did not need a large opening. It only needed the smallest gap. New graves appeared faster than people could accept. The earth barely settled before it had to open again. The damp smell of soil mixed with exhaustion spread through the village. People worked like shadows without the strength to feel. When night fell again, light was not enough to drive fear away. It only revealed the strain etched into the faces of those still standing. No one spoke of tomorrow in a distant sense. Tomorrow meant only how many would still wake at dawn. Someone suggested waiting one more night. Others shook their heads immediately. Another night could be too late. When children had already died, every test had failed. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood that hesitation now would raise the cost faster than any choice. Livestock lay dead in the fields, like warnings that needed no explanation. The animals had no part in human arguments. They only reflected the scale of what was happening, and that scale had passed every safe limit. In that moment, the village realized it had lost the one luxury humans depend on most: time. Every decision from here on would have to be made before certainty arrived, not because they did not want certainty, but because certainty would come too late. When children died first and animals fell in numbers, no one could convince themselves that this was temporary. What was unfolding had its own rhythm, and that rhythm was accelerating. From that moment, the survival clock officially began to run. It needed no ticking sound and no visible face. Everyone felt it counting down with every breath. And once the clock had started, there was no room left for hesitation. A light rain fell before dawn, not enough to wash anything away. It only softened the ground and preserved what had passed over it. When the sun rose low and weak, people began to notice the first irregularity on the path leading from the cemetery into the village. Footprints stood clearly in the mud, so fresh that water had not yet filled them in. They were not the marks of many people. There was no chaos of running steps or dragging weight, just a steady, deliberate line, as if whoever made them knew exactly where they were going. The footprints did not lead out of the village. They led inward. That detail tightened the chest of everyone who saw them, because the cemetery had only one purpose, and these steps were leaving it behind. The first man who noticed them did not speak at once. He stood longer than usual, eyes fixed on the mud, as if hoping he was mistaken. But others arrived, and with each new look, the fear grew denser. No one raised their voice. They only looked at one another, then back down at the ground. The trail led to an open patch where grass grew thin. There, the earth had been disturbed, not deeply, but clearly enough that it could not be dismissed as chance. Mud had been pushed aside. The ground had not yet settled. The hollow was not wide, but it was the right size for a human body. No one needed to say what they were thinking. The chill did not come from the sight itself, but from its orderliness. If this were a prank, it was too precise. If an animal, the marks would not be so even. And if it were a person, the next question was, who could have done this while the entire village was exhausted without anyone noticing? A small group returned to the cemetery. They walked slowly, and no one spoke. Each step felt heavier as they neared the row of new graves. At one grave, the soil had sunk unusually, not collapsed, but no longer level with the others. The earth was softer. The grass had not yet taken hold. Someone knelt and placed a hand on the ground. He pulled it back at once, as if he had touched something warmer than it should be. Not heat, something wrong. They decided to bring a horse, not to pull or carry, but to test. In this place, people believed there were things humans could overlook that animals could not be fooled by. The horse was led along the path that crossed the cemetery. It slowed, its ears lifted, its eyes widened. When it reached the suspected grave, it stopped completely. The handler pulled on the reins. The horse did not move. It stepped back once, then again. Hooves scraped the ground. Breath came fast. No further test was needed. No additional sign was required. The animal had spoken in its own way. The shock spread faster than the news of children dying, because this was what people called proof. No longer a feeling, no longer a dream or a suspicion. This was something that could be pointed at, gathered around, and seen together. Those who had urged patience could no longer stand firm before this. No one said it was enough to conclude anything. But no one said it was not. The earlier uncertainty dissolved and left behind a dangerous emptiness. When that emptiness appears, people tend to fill it with action. Word traveled through the village within hours. Those who had not seen it with their own eyes still believed. Belief was easier now than doubt. Doubt required time. Time was something they no longer had. Eyes changed. They no longer drifted or searched. They lingered longer on those who had already been suspected. Whispers became more direct. Nods passed between people who had never spoken to one another about this before. Violence does not begin with action. It begins with permission. And that permission arrives when everyone agrees they have enough reason. Footprints in the mud, disturbed earth, a horse refusing to cross. Each sign alone could be explained away. Together they formed a story everyone understood. No one spoke of what would come next. But in the way they looked toward the cemetery, there was a new resolve. Fear was no longer something to avoid. It became something to confront. And once confrontation begins, there are no gentle choices left. Someone said they could not let things continue like this. Another nodded. Then another. There was no vote, no ritual, just agreement, forming quickly and in silence. From that moment on, violence was no longer seen as absolutely forbidden. It was wrapped in the language of necessity. When fear gains proof, people allow themselves to cross boundaries they once swore they never would. And right there where the mud had not yet dried, the village crossed into a new threshold. From that point forward, what they were about to do was no longer a panicked reaction. It became an action given permission. No one spoke the decision, yet everyone knew what would come next. After the footprints in the mud and the horse refusing to cross, there was no room left for gentle questions. Silence led the way as they returned to the cemetery, carrying shovels, torches, and a weight no one dared to name. The coffin lay there as it had for days. No movement, no sound. Only damp earth holds the wooden boards in place. They began to dig slowly. Each strike of the shovel made hearts beat faster. No one urged speed. No one wanted to be the first to arrive. Soil was pushed aside, revealing the darkened lid. The nails were intact. The bindings are still tight. No sign of disturbance from the outside. That should have brought relief. It did not. It only turned curiosity into something denser and more frightening. They paused for a moment, not to pray but to draw a deep breath. The air was heavy, difficult to pull in. The smell of wet earth mixed with old wood, familiar yet wrong. Someone reached out to touch the lid and pulled back at once as if burned, not from heat, but from a cold that felt unnatural. The nails were removed one by one. Metal sounded briefly, then vanished, swallowed by the surrounding quiet. No one spoke. The torches were brought closer. When the lid was lifted, time seemed to slow. There was no scream, no cry, only a silence heavier than any sound. Inside the body lay unchanged in a way no one had been taught to expect. The skin was not gray, not drawn tight. There was no smell of decay. The face held familiar lines, as if the person were only sleeping more deeply than usual. There was a blood, not much. A dark smear at the corner of the mouth, and a stain on the burial cloth. It was not dry or cracked as it should have been. It looked fresh enough to chill the spine. A few stepped back by instinct. Another stood frozen as if held in place. Eyes moved from the body to one another. No explanation was needed. No verdict spoken. What they saw spoke for itself. In that moment, the stories once whispered became too clear to deny. A trembling hand reached out and brushed the wrist. The skin was cold, but not stiff. Not the cold of something that had lain underground long enough. Silence stretched another beat. No one said what they were thinking, yet everyone was thinking the same thing. There was no stench, no mark of time. Everything that should have been present was missing, and that absence was more terrifying than any grotesque sight. It challenged the one measure people relied on to separate the living from the dead. Someone whispered a prayer, then stopped halfway through. The words sounded misplaced. They did not belong here. No one continued. They only stared, then stared again, as if the second look might bring a different result. It did not. A bead of sweat rolled down someone's temple, not from heat, but from fear. A sharp, lucid fear. This was no longer speculation, no longer dreams or indirect signs. This was something lying directly before them. For a brief moment, someone wanted to believe it was a rare coincidence. Some bodies decayed slowly. That cold soil could preserve form longer than expected. Those excuses died instantly when they met the sight of blood still fresh. Silence lasted long enough for each person to reach their own conclusion, and when they lifted their eyes from the coffin, they realized those conclusions were terrifyingly the same. There was no doubt left, no space for uncertainty to survive. Earlier arguments lost all meaning. Calls for patience became obsolete. What lay before them was not a story to explain, but a reality to be dealt with. Someone lowered the lid again very slowly, as if afraid of waking something. Wood met wood with a dull sound. It felt like a full stop, not to debate but to hesitation itself. When they turned away, no one looked back. Not out of fear, but because it was no longer necessary. What needed to be seen had been seen. What needed to be believed had been believed. The path back to the village felt shorter than the walk there. No one spoke, but the steps were steadier. The decision had formed without needing to be declared. From the moment the coffin was opened, doubt ended. And when doubt ends, people no longer remain still. They returned to the cementiques while light still clung to the sky, not because they were braver, but because they feared the night. Night had become a place where anything could happen without permission. Daytime gave them the feeling that they were still the ones choosing, not the ones being driven forward. There was no declaration, no opening ritual. What they were about to do needed no further persuasion. After the coffin had been opened and doubt had ended, what followed was only order, an old order remembered from stories many had heard as children and hoped never to witness. They set the coffin on level ground. Eyes avoided one another. No one wanted to become the one in charge, yet no one left. Agreement existed in silence. When one person stepped forward, the others kept just enough distance to see without having to touch. The stake was brought out. It was not new. It had been prepared earlier as a possibility never spoken aloud. Rough wood, a sharpened point. The hands holding it trembled slightly, not from cold, but from understanding the meaning of the motion to come. In that moment, someone thought of the children who had died of the animals that had fallen of the sleepless nights. Those images lined up and straightened what remained of reason. The stake was placed where it had always been taught to go. No one explained why that place was right. It was right because it had always been done that way. When force was applied, the impact sounded dull and final. There was no cry, no resistance, only an ending confirmed by sound. A strange feeling followed immediately. Not quite relief, not quite fear. It was like the moment when severe pain suddenly stops. The body has not yet understood what happened, but it knows the old rhythm has been cut. They continued. They did not pause to think further. Once the first boundary had been crossed, the next ones stood lower. A blade was brought out, not newly sharpened, sharp enough to finish what needed finishing. Those who turned away were the ones who understood they did not need to see to believe. Those who stayed believed they had to see it to truly end. The movement was quick, not drawn out, not theatrical. No one spoke. The silence now came not from fear, but from focus. When that part was done, the air changed in a way difficult to describe, as if an invisible pressure had been lifted from the chests of those standing nearby. They did not stop there. The stories had never stopped there. What followed was the part many feared most because it required closer contact with what they were trying to remove. The heart was taken out as quickly as possible, not from curiosity, but because it was the final step in a sequence believed to be necessary. A fire was lit, not large. It did not need to be, just enough to turn what was held into ash. The sharp smell spread, then thinned into the air. No one commented. No one turned away again. They had gone too far to retreat through avoidance. When the fire died and only ash remained, they stood there for a while. No one knew what to do next. There was no cheering, no sign of victory. But one thing was clear. Many people's breathing had slowed. Hands that had been clenched loosened. Satisfaction came late and did not last. It was not joy. It was the cold completion of a task done with no other choice. Guilt followed soon after. Guilt did not explode. It slipped in quietly as people began to understand that what they had done could not be washed away by any prayer. Some turned their faces away from the ashes, not from fear, but from knowing they would have to live with this memory. Others stared for a long time, as if trying to imprint the moment, to remind themselves they had acted for a reason. They closed the coffin again. This time the movement was firmer. No one touched the wood afterward. The earth was filled back in quickly. There was no effort to smooth it flat. No one cared about appearances. What mattered had been finished. On the walk back to the village, someone noticed the wind had shifted. Not a sign, just a small detail. But in moments like this, small details were felt more clearly. Someone drew a deep breath and realized their chest no longer felt as heavy as before. When they passed through the village gate, no one spoke of victory. No one declared that everything was over, but there was a subtle change in their eyes. The rigid tension had softened. Determination gave way to exhaustion. Someone whispered that perhaps tonight would be different. No one answered. No one dared to promise. But the thought lingered long enough to be carried home. Something ended that afternoon. It might have been a chain of events. It might have been a belief, or it might have been a piece of innocence they would never recover. And it was also possible that what had just begun would only reveal its true shape when night fell once more. No one hurried to leave the cemetery after the fire died down. The ashes, still warm, were gathered carefully, treated as something both dangerous and necessary. No one explained why this step mattered. They only knew that long before explanations existed, those who came before had done the same. In this moment, tradition was no longer blind belief, but the last thread tying them to survival. The ashes were carried back to the village in small cloth bundles. No display, no grand rite, just the deliberate movements of people who had finished the hardest part and now needed to complete what remained. Water was boiled, then allowed to cool. Ash was mixed into small bowls. The liquid turned a pale gray, like early morning mist. No one said it would work, but no one refused. The first to drink were those who had come closest to death. The most affected family received their bowls first. The mother's hands trembled, but she did not turn away. She drank in small sips, not out of courage, but because there was nothing left to lose. The taste was unpleasant. No one pretended otherwise. Throats tightened. Stomachs clenched. A few coughed dryly, but they finished it. Then they waited. No loud prayers, no expectation of immediate miracles, just waiting. Change did not arrive in an instant. It came quietly. The son who had breathed shallowly began to draw deeper breaths as night fell. The wife who had not left her bed could sit up without dizziness. The signs were small, easy to miss in ordinary times. But now, nothing went unnoticed. By the next morning, the child had eaten a bowl of porridge without vomiting. A cow rose after lying still all day. Not everyone recovered. There was no complete miracle, but the downward spiral was interrupted, and that alone was enough to open a narrow space for hope to slip in. Word spread quickly, but without noise. No one celebrated. No one declared victory. They only looked at one another and nodded very slightly. More bowls of ash water were prepared. There was no hesitation now, no debate. Once something begins to work, people learn to accept it far faster than they ever learned to believe in it. For the first time in many nights, the village breathed again. Not deeply, not in full relief, but more evenly. Lamps were turned off a little earlier. Not all at once, but enough to sense that night no longer held absolute control. Sleep returned in fragments. People still woke during the night, but the sensation of breath being drawn away was less violent. Dreams of figures standing at the foot of the bed grew rarer. When they came, they were fainter, like memories already retreating. The family once at the center of suspicion became the first to be watched with hope. No one apologized. No one revisited what had been said, but the coldness around them eased. Bowls were brought without guarded glances, only the tense focus of people waiting for outcomes. Someone noticed their chest no longer hurt when breathing deeply. Someone else realized the night cough had softened. These changes accumulated slowly but clearly. Along with them came a strange feeling. Not joy, but released the relief of finally seeing a direction forward. The sense of revulsion did not disappear. Ash was still ash. The thought of its origin still tightened the stomach. But revulsion and necessity fused in a way the village had never known. When life is drawn closer again, survival teaches people how to accept contradictions they would normally reject. The second afternoon passed without another child dying. No more livestock fell. Those still weak remained weak, but no worse. The silence now was different, not heavy, careful, like a breath held just before being released. No one said everything was over, but everyone sensed the curve had begun to turn. That was enough to stand a little straighter, to walk more slowly, to meet one another's eyes without looking away. What had been killing them was now swallowed like bitter medicine. No one wanted to dwell on its source, but no one denied the result. In moments like this, morality is not the only thing weighed. Life demands choices people would rather never face. When night came and the village did not collapse immediately into panic, they understood that what they had done had touched the core of their fear. What once threatened them had been forced to serve them. And in that paradox, a rough truth emerged. What had been killing them was now what saved them. Silence returned to the village in a way no one expected. It did not fall like a curtain. It slipped into the mornings, when there was no longer the sound of relentless coughing behind closed doors. It settled into afternoons when no one ran in panic to find a healer. It was present when night came, and no new names were whispered in fear. The illness stopped, not as abruptly as it had arrived, but clearly enough to be undeniable. Those who had stood on the edge between life and death began to move slowly through their yards. Children ate more and slept longer. Livestock stood on their legs again and returned to the plow, still weak but steady. The old rhythm did not return at once, but the downward spiral had been halted. There was no celebration, no bells, no large gathering. Satisfaction arrived quietly and under restraint, as if everyone understood that making too much of it might cause this fragile state to shatter. Nods replaced congratulations. Eyes met a little longer, but did not cling. No one spoke of that night again. No one asked for details. No one retold the sequence of events. Words once used vanished from daily speech. When people passed the cemetery, they looked straight ahead. When fires were lit, no one made the connection. When water was boiled, no one recalled the pale gray bowls that had saved them. This silence was not forgetting. It was an unspoken agreement. Each person kept their own portion of memory and did not place it on another's shoulders. To speak of it would open questions no one wanted to answer. Who had been right, who had been wrong, and what the true cost of survival had been. In the days that followed, the village relearned how to exist together. Work was divided as before. Paths were swept clean. Houses opened their doors earlier, but small changes remained unnamed. The distance between certain families lingered, not from resentment, but because what had happened could not be folded away neatly. Peace returned, but it was incomplete. It carried sharp edges that could be felt with the slightest touch. Nights were quieter, yet no one slept as deeply as before. Some still jolted awake out of old habit, then realized there was no longer a reason to panic. The body needed time to trust what the mind had accepted. Children played outside again, but did not wander far. They laughed, but stopped sooner. Adults watched and let him be, not from a need to control, but from understanding that some marks must grow dull only with time. Some felt satisfaction cautiously. They believed they had done what was necessary and that life had been preserved. Others felt hollow, as if something had been taken along with the fear. When pressure disappeared, an emptiness surfaced, and not everyone knew what to fill it with. In brief conversations, people spoke of the weather, of crops, of work. They avoided subjects that led to why. Not from fear of argument, but from knowing that some things cannot be rearranged to sound acceptable. The cemetery grew quiet again. The ground settled. Grass rose and covered the last traces. People went there no more and no less than before. On the surface, everything returned to its old rhythm, but the village's heartbeat had changed. Satisfaction existed alongside that emptiness, like two sides of the same coin. One could not be kept without accepting the other. Survival brought relief, but surviving this way left questions with nowhere to be placed. No one wanted to speak of the price that had been paid. No one wanted to count the boundaries that had been crossed. To name them would make the fragile peace tremble, and trembling was something no one was ready to face. So the village chose silence, not to hide, but to continue. This silence became part of the new life. It did not heal everything, but it was enough to allow people to keep moving forward one day at a time. There are prices no one wants to name, and because they remain unspoken, they stay longer in the memories of those who paid them. Understanding did not arrive when the village needed it most. It came later, after everything had settled, when there was finally enough space for people to look back at what they had lived through. Not everyone wanted to look, but time has its own way of forcing memory to rise once fear has withdrawn. Those who survived began to notice patterns they had been too shaken to connect before. The illness had been present long before stories of the dead who would not leave began to spread. It started with lingering coughs, with fatigue that had no clear cause, with shortened breath in tightly closed rooms where entire families slept together to conserve warmth. When the sickness accelerated, it followed the rhythm of something that needed no magic to exist. It moved from house to house along ordinary paths, through shared bowls of water, through blankets, through hurried embraces, as people tried to hold one another together. The weakest fell first: children, the elderly, those already worn thin by hunger and worry. Tuberculosis was the name people would use later, a cold and precise name. It explained why breath was drained away, why chests ached, and why bodies wasted despite eating. It also explained why poorly ventilated houses became the fastest breeding grounds. But at the time, there was no language to name it, no way to see what was moving through the air. Without microscopes, people saw through fear, and fear needs shape. It needs a face to cling to. When illness had no visible form, it borrowed the forms of old stories. Of Strigoi, of the dead who refused to leave, of something that drained life in the night. What they fought was not only a disease, they fought the helplessness of not knowing what was killing them. When the cause cannot be controlled, people try to control symbols. Coffins, ashes, rituals. Those actions did not cure bacteria, but they did calm panic. The recovery they witnessed after the final rituals was not a miracle. It coincided with the disease reaching its peak and beginning to subside naturally. It coincided with the loss of the most vulnerable and the survival of those with stronger resistance. It coincided with windows being opened more often, fires being kept longer, and sleep habits changing out of fear. Those changes unintentionally created better living conditions. Air circulated more freely. The distance between the sick and the healthy increased. And when conditions shifted, the disease slowed. But in collective memory, that slowing became inseparable from the most violent act the village had ever committed. Beneath the medical explanation lay another layer harder to see: family trauma. Successive deaths in confined spaces created prolonged psychological pressure. People lived in constant vigilance. They slept poorly. They ate poorly. Bodies weakened not only from illness, but from fear. Fear thinned immune defenses in ways no one could recognize at the time. Dreams of figures standing at the foot of the bed, episodes of sleep paralysis, and the sensation of breath being pulled away did not come solely from belief in the dead. They came from exhausted minds trying to rest in an environment saturated with the danger signals. When bodies are too tired to distinguish dream from waking, fear takes on vivid form. The families most deeply in mourning were also those under the greatest psychological strain. They lost loved ones, then lost strength through prolonged grief. Their decline was not proof of a curse. It was evidence of trauma left untreated. But trauma leaves no marks as visible as disease. It is easily assigned to other stories. Looking back, those who understood realized they had been fighting many things at once: a disease without a name, a harsh living environment, and a collective fear in search of release. Strigoi became the convenient name to hold all of it. That name was not created out of malice. It was created out of a lack of tools. When science did not yet exist, stories became the only way to transmit danger. Stories turned invisible threats into something that could be avoided, confronted, and acted upon. Strigoi was a language of survival in an age without testing, without antibiotics, without maps of transmission. It was how people tried to reclaim a sense of control when the world felt unbearably random. This understanding did not make what happened any lighter. It did not erase memories of the night the grave was opened or the afternoon of fire, but it placed those actions in a different frame, not one of monsters, but of human beings trying to survive with what they had. Late understanding carried its own sorrow, sorrow for acts that could not be undone, sorrow that those who died never benefited from the knowledge that came later. But it also carried a quiet forgiveness. When science did not yet exist, people spread fear through legend. Strigoi was the name used before microscopes. When everything finally settled, the village stopped searching for further proof. No more digging the earth. No more counting bruises. No more straining to hear footsteps in the night. What needed to be done had been done, and what needed to be believed had been believed. But that quiet did not mean the horror had left. It had only changed its place. The monster had never been in the grave. The grave was merely where people placed their fear so they could see it. When fear has a shape, it becomes easier to confront. You can point at it. You can act on it. You can end it with a decisive gesture. But what is truly dangerous rarely stays within such clear boundaries. What killed them did not need damp soil or coffin wood to survive. It lived in sealed rooms where breaths layered over one another. It moved through the most intimate gestures. It grew on exhaustion and ignorance, and when people had no language to name it, they gave it a story. Fear without a name is the most resilient kind. It does not demand evidence. It needs only space. The space between understanding and not knowing, between what happens and the ability to explain it. In that space, imagination finishes the work. People need stories to survive, not because stories are always true, but because they allow movement when reality is too unclear. Stories gather chaos into order. They give scattered tragedies a shared cause. They turn random loss into something that can be understood. And what can be understood is easier to bear than what remains formless. In this village, the story was called Strigoi. Elsewhere, it might carry a different name, but the function is the same. It turns fear into an object. It allows a community to act together in a single direction. It creates the feeling that something can be defeated if done the right way. What deserves reflection is not that they believed the legend, but what they did once they believed. When a story becomes a moral compass, ethics can bend to fit survival. Boundaries that once seemed firm become flexible. Acts once unimaginable begin to feel necessary. Later, when science offered a cold and precise explanation, it could not erase collective memory. Those who lived through that time did not need to be told they were wrong. They needed a way to keep living with what they had done. And sometimes the old story served them better than the bare truth, because truth does not always bring comfort. Knowing it was a disease does not bring the dead. Knowing it was trauma does not shorten the nights in memory. A story at least gives a frame in which pain can be placed, a place to store it without having to face it every day. The monster is not in the grave because the grave ends the body. True horror lives in how people respond when they do not understand what is happening. It emerges when fear is shared, but knowledge is not. When communities close in to protect themselves and unintentionally create new cycles of panic. What happened in this village needs no supernatural force to be frightening. It is frightening because it shows how far people can go when pushed into the dark corner of not knowing, and it shows the power of stories in shaping collective action. Looking back, one may say they misunderstood, but misunderstanding is not the same as malice. It is often the product of circumstances where choices must be made faster than reflection allows. Late understanding does not erase responsibility, but it adds depth to judgment. The village went on. Children grew up hearing softened versions of the story, sharp edges blurred with time, yet the core feeling remained, the sense that some threats cannot be buried with shovels and soil. On the quietest nights when there is no sickness, no crying, no torches burning, people still feel something at the edge of awareness. Not the presence of the dead, but the memory of how fear once guided them. Some horrors do not need a corpse to exist. They live in the space between knowledge and belief. They grow when stories replace explanation, and they will continue to appear wherever people need a shape for what they cannot yet name.